Okay, Tom, you've got this magnum opus coming out, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, which is not something you dreamed up and decided to write a few Saturdays ago. This is a chestnut you've been warming now for 30 and 40 years. So, given that seems to be a climax of your not just your study, but your real deep wrestling with Paul, what he's about, what he's interested in, and all the various schools of interpretation of Paul, what do you think is going to be your main contribution into Pauline studies in this book,
Yeah,
Paul and the Faithfulness of God?
it does go back a long way for me. I started to try seriously to write this book in the mid-1980s when I was teaching at McGill University in Montreal. And I remember vividly shaping it and thinking, now we need to say this and we need to do that and so on. And then being frustrated that I found there were other things I needed to do first to kind of lay the groundwork. And I've been working my way back to this again and again, and now we're virtually there. And one of the big things for me has been that I grew up in a scholarly world where people would regularly say, well, Paul was a bit muddled about this, and that bit of his letters, he didn't really mean that. That was just some stuff he dashed off, but the real centre is this. And so I grew up in a world where it was common to say that Paul was inconsistent, incoherent, that his central ideas don't quite fit together, that some of them are brilliant, but then others of them sort of fall away. And people would excuse that by saying, well, he was just dashing these letters off, and he wasn't a systematic theologian. He wasn't trying to make all the dots join up, and so on. And I want to say, well, yes, he often did write at speed. He often did write very much to a context. He wasn't writing successive issues of a kind of Calvin's Institutes. He wasn't saying, here's the first volume of my systematics now. Here, these are letters. They're real letters to real people. However, the fact that they're real letters to real people doesn't of itself mean that he's inconsistent. I write dozens and dozens of emails to people and a fair number of letters to people. Often people write to me about quite different problems, and often I don't really know very much about their situations, and so I give advice and encouragement, whatever. But I hope that if you put all my letters and emails together, you wouldn't find major inconsistency. You might, but I hope you wouldn't find major inconsistencies. So the fact that something is done on the run, on the fly, and to different situations doesn't of itself mean that the ideas don't match up. The question is, how do Paul's ideas match up? And so people have tried to say, well, justification is the centre of Paul, and all those other things about being in Christ or ethics or whatever, yeah, that's sort of important, but it's off at the side and it doesn't quite fit. Or Paul is an apocalyptic theologian. He's all about God breaking in and doing a new thing, and all that other stuff about Abraham and the Old Testament, that's sort of around there and he plays with it, but it doesn't quite fit, and so on and so forth. And people have had all sorts of different ways of putting Paul together. So that's really part of the centre of my project, is to say, is there a way in which Paul does make sense? And my argument quite simply is that in Jewish theology, such as it is, there are three main themes: God, God's people, God's future, monotheism, election, eschatology. And that what Paul has done is to take each of those central Jewish themes and to rethink it, to rework it around Jesus and the Spirit. And so I've, at the heart of the book, part 3 of my book, I've tried to work out in considerable detail, taking all the relevant texts, I hope, into consideration, the way in which Paul talks about God in the light of Jesus and the Spirit, so that this is a very Jewish vision, but completely refocused around Jesus and the Spirit. The way in which he talks about God's people, likewise, the way in which he talks about the future for God's world and God's people. So that's really the centre of it, and I've argued that Paul is actually a deeply, radically coherent Jewish, or if you like, refreshed Jewish thinker. That's really at the centre of it. And then as we pan out from that, I am trying to say that Paul was doing that in the service of the mission which he had. He wasn't an armchair thinker. He was doing this because he believed it was his job, it was his vocation, to plant churches, i.e. little communities of Jesus followers, in Caesar's world in such a way that they would be communities shaped by this message, by this gospel, by this theology, so that they would be united, so that they would be holy, so that they would be able to take forward the mission of God. So that's at the heart of the book. But I found in order to do that I needed to do some quite interesting, to me, other things as well, because Paul lived in three worlds at once. He lived in the Jewish world, he lived in the Hellenistic world, the Greek world of late antiquity, the world that Alexander the Great had sort of made the Greek world a few hundred years before, but he lived in the world of the Roman Empire. And so what I've tried to do is to sketch the way in which those worlds worked and to see how Paul belongs in those worlds, the world of Jewish culture, the world of ancient philosophy, the world of ancient religion, the world of ancient empire and politics. So the first chunk of the book, part one, is quite a long exploration of Paul's Jewish, Greek and Roman worlds. And then we put Paul within those worlds and we say, what was his own worldview, his own mindset? And then that sets the context for saying, here is his theology, and this is how it's coherent. And then in the final section of the book, we revisit those worlds of empire, religion, philosophy, Jewish culture. And then we say, so what contribution does Paul make in those worlds? How does it play out? What does this community, this theology look like in those worlds? So it's a quite different project from what I thought I was doing 40 years ago, but there are all sorts of continuities with what I was doing, but obviously my thought and my understanding of Paul has developed a lot over that time, and I've tried to do that in dialogue with most of the major current schools of interpretation in at least the modern Western world of scholarship, though I'm very much aware that there are people writing about Paul in other areas that I haven't studied in detail, like African theologians and Asian theologians, and I regret that because there's such a welter of scholarship to get your head round in the Western world at the moment, I haven't been able to do too much beyond that. But I hope that others might be stimulated to take what I've done and to say, how does this mesh with or dialogue with people in those worlds? Because Paul, just to sum it up, I cut my intellectual teeth on people like Plato and Aristotle when I was a student, and Paul ranks with them as a thinker. He is drawing together huge ideas, complex, abstract and concrete discussions, and putting it into a new synthesis and doing it with a power and a passion that has seldom been rivaled ever since. And it seems to me, therefore, Paul is not just a figure that some Christians might like to study if they had a few wet Thursday afternoons to do it on. Paul is a thinker who remains seminal for the whole world history. And I hope that by writing the book in the way that I have, I've made this accessible and available not just to Christian theologians who might want to read it, though I hope they will, but to a much wider audience as well. That would be my aim and hope.
Tom, given the breadth and the complexity of what you're doing, and drawing together so many threads and interacting with so many dialogue partners, how would you say that this book, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, how does it open up new vistas or new conversations in Pauline studies?
Yeah, one of the main conversations that always goes on with Paul is how do we place him in relation to first century Judaism, to the Jewish world of his day? Is he basically a Jewish thinker who happens to believe that the Messiah has come but without too much else changing? Or has he transformed something, the early movement of Christianity, from a basically Jewish movement into something totally different? And what I've tried to do in exploring the Jewish world of Paul's day, which I've done at some length in chapter 2 of this book, is to set the context then for saying here are some quite new ways in for understanding, particularly the central thing, Paul's vision of God. One of the things which I've enjoyed exploring over the last 10 years or so is the way in which many Second Temple Jews really didn't believe that their God had ever properly returned to the temple as he'd said he would. In Isaiah 40 to 55, in Malachi 3, in the prophet Zechariah, in some of the Psalms as well, they celebrate the fact that Yahweh, Israel's God, is going to come back, is going to defeat evil, is going to establish his glory in the temple once more. And we sort of know what they thought that might look like, because at the end of the book of Exodus, with the construction of the tabernacle, in 1 Kings 8, when Solomon builds the temple, and one or two other points, we have this idea of here is the temple, and the glory of the Lord comes into the house, and the house is filled with smoke and glory and light and a sense of presence, and everyone falls on their faces, and this is just amazing. And then we read the Second Temporal literature, and despite the fact that Isaiah said the glory of the Lord will be revealed and all flesh shall see it together, we scratch our heads and say, it doesn't actually seem to have happened. And then we realize that in the New Testament they're saying it has happened, but it didn't look like that. It looked like Jesus, and it looked like the Spirit. And actually the book of Acts is about that, if we had eyes to see. But to stick with Paul, when Paul talks about the church as the temple of the living God, Paul is a first century Jew who knows that the temple is the place which God said he would come to and live in and reveal his glory in. So when he talks about the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, this is temple language. So one of the lines of thought which I hope others will pick up and develop is that so much of Paul's vision of Jesus and of the Spirit is rooted in the ancient Jewish hope that God would come back at last, would make his glory known, and would thereby transform the world. Romans 8, for instance, one of the most famous chapters in all of Paul, is not normally read in this way, and I think it should be. And I think, therefore, for instance, that whereas some people have said, well, the early Christians had a high view of Jesus, but it took them 3 or 4 centuries to have an equally high view of the Spirit. Well, yes, the early fathers did take a while to catch up. But when Paul is talking about the Spirit in passages like 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, in passages like Romans 8, in a verse like Galatians 4:6 following, what he's saying about the Spirit is itself rooted in the idea of the return of Yahweh to Zion. You cannot have a higher view of the Spirit than that. So I would hope at the level of, if you like, in the abstract terms, the doctrine of God, what we say about what Paul says about the God of Israel, then we would see that in Jesus and the Spirit, he is saying some absolutely stunning things, which most Poorline theologians, I think, have not even begun to glimpse. And when we see that, then all sorts of other vistas open up in those other areas of what Paul says about the people of God, that the people of God in Christ, is it the new Israel? Is it the true Israel? Is it something quite different? Paul was struggling to say what had to be said there. We've got all sorts of political sensitivities about saying any of that because of the great 20th century problems about the persecution of the Jews, etc. But we have to, in a sense, we've got to be sensitive to that, but we have to set it aside to the extent of saying, let's track with what Paul is doing and see if we can find appropriate ways of saying that. And I hope that I have tried to map that out a bit. And then when we talk about the ultimate future, one of the great things is that so many Christians still assume that the name of the game for the ultimate future is simply to go to heaven when you die. And for Paul, there's no question we're talking about a whole new creation. The whole world for Paul is now God's holy land, and for Paul, God the Creator is going to renew the whole of creation. Again, that's what Romans 8 is all about, also 1 Corinthians 15. And it seems to me that many Christians need to get inside that hope, understand how and why that's the hope that Paul set out. So in the area of God, God's people, God's future. In each of these areas, I hope I have set out things which will be opportunities for others to take these further and to explore more fully.
Amazing stuff. Now, a lot of Poorline theologies I've seen, they tend to jump in with something like straight to Romans, or maybe use that as a template, or they'll look at a number of key themes. Paul on the faithfulness of God begins like no other Poorline book I've read. I mean, you begin with Philemon. With Philemon, he is the poor cousin of the family. If this was the Antipodes, he'd be New Zealand. So, I mean, yes, beginning with Philemon, I mean, what is the deal with that?
Well, as you know, New Zealand is one of the most beautiful countries on
that
earth.
Is true. That is true.
That's why they filmed The Lord of the Rings there and all the rest of it. But actually, that's quite an interesting parallel. The thing about Philemon is, it's just a couple of dozen verses. It's a tiny little story, printed on one page, but it's a little window through which we can see all sorts of things going on. And I've often said to students, and this is what I try to do in that opening chapter, that actually you can start with Philemon and discover that all the big issues are being raised. And the way that I do that is because, as people I'm sure watching this will know, Philemon is a letter to somebody who owns a slave about the fact that the slave has come to Paul in prison, the slave has got converted, and Paul is sending him back. And that's a very, very delicate thing to do in the ancient world. This is a major cultural fault line, a major problem. And Paul is beginning a revolution at that point. It's not the only letter we have from somebody to a master about a slave or a dependent in some way. And so I start with another letter, with a letter from Pliny, writing a couple of generations after Paul. And there are other ancient letters as well about somebody who is sort of sitting in this awkward gap between the writer and the recipient of the letter. And I compare Paul's letter and Pliny's letter. And you can see a whole world of difference. At one level they're the same, at another level it's totally different. And exploring what the difference is what the whole book is about. What difference did it make to be an early Christian from being an ordinary ancient Roman living by the ordinary rules of that society? And one of the reasons I did that was I didn't want to jump straight into the big crunchy theological topics. I wanted to say, in order to study Paul, we have to earth him in the real world of his day, the Greco-Roman world, the world where slaves were treated like this and women were treated like that, etc., etc. So we have to map the ancient worldviews of the world where Paul lived in order then to see how Paul's worldview is different, and then to ask, why is it different? And that's when we get into the theology. And at the heart of Philemon, and people often miss this, is this extraordinary kind of symbolic thing that Paul does. And I often, when I'm lecturing about this, I find myself instinctively doing it visually. He is reaching out one arm and saying, Philemon, you're my partner. You and I have worked together. We belong together. You owe me your very life, actually, but you and I are absolutely bonded together. And then he reaches out the other arm and says, now here's this young man, Onesimus, who is my own child. I have become his father in my imprisonment. Obviously that's because Onesimus has become a Christian under Paul's ministry. And he's my very heart. I love him dearly. And so we find this cross-shaped image of Paul stretching out his two arms, embracing Philemon and Onesimus, and saying, now, I want you two to be reconciled. And not only reconciled, but perhaps you'll do even more than I say. And I think in that perhaps we see the hint that Paul wants Philemon actually to give Onesimus his freedom. Now that's a tricky thing, because then you'd have a bunch of slaves queuing up at Paul's door saying, please will you write to my master to tell him to give me my freedom. Paul is doing something socially and culturally explosive. But this mission of reconciliation based on the cross is what, when Paul is put up against it, what is your ministry all about? It's what I'm about is the ministry of reconciliation. And so the end of 2 Corinthians 5 resonates very much with Philemon, that Paul says God has entrusted us with a ministry of reconciliation. And that is, if you like, reaching out to God and reaching out to the world. How has God in Christ reconciled the world to himself? But it's also reaching out, as in Philippians, to Euodia and Syntyche. We don't know who they were, but there were two women in Philippi who were at loggerheads. Paul wants them to be reconciled. Reaching out to Philemon and Onesimus, reaching out to Jews and Gentiles, reaching out in all directions. And it's always cross-shaped. And Paul is living that. So in Philemon, though it's this tiny little letter, this is what I mean when I say it's like a little window, but if you press your nose up against this little window, you can see the whole landscape. And it's a landscape called reconciliation, and in the middle of that landscape you get the cross. And that's what Paul's all about. Philemon's a great place to start.
Okay, Tom, well, if you're covering these amazing topics of, of God, God's future, God's people, where on earth do you touch on the real big juicy stuff we all want to hear about? Which of course is justification by faith and salvation. I mean, the rest of the stuff is good, but for us, for us diehard Protestants, that's just the gravy.
Yeah.
With the meat and the potatoes, justification by faith.
Yeah.
Where's that come in?
Justification by faith is pretty close to the center of the project. Where the book comes to its climax is in part 3. Part 3 is structured God, God's people, God's future. So the people of God is in the middle. And so the way that justification works for Paul, and this is, of course, the shaping of the book depends on the argument which I make, as it were, is that the whole point of salvation for Paul is that this is what God has planned to give to the world through the people he launched when he called Abraham. Now, this is very basic for me, and it's a deeply Jewish insight. I go back to that rabbi who said in, I think, the 3rd or 4th century, that God said to himself, I will make Adam first, and if he goes wrong, I will send Abraham to sort it all out. That's a deeply Jewish insight which corresponds to the structure of Genesis, that Genesis 12 is where God says, now we're going to get the project back on track, the project that went horribly pear-shaped with Adam, that almost went multiply pear-shaped with Noah, and that then has clearly resulted in mega-human arrogance with the Tower of Babel. Now we're sorting it out, Genesis 12. So the question of salvation, of how the world gets sorted out and how humans get sorted out and forgiven and justified and put right and all that, is, in Jewish thought, part of the question of how then has God done what he said to Abraham he would do. Some people don't like looking at it like that, but I'm afraid Paul did look at it like that. So that for me, the question of justification and salvation is right at the centre of the question of who are God's people, not simply who are the people of God as though all this is just a matter of a community and by the way we get saved on the side, as it were. The point of the people of God at the beginning was this dynamic idea that God calls Abraham to be the means of rescuing Adam and hence of getting the creation project back on track. But Abraham by himself can't do it, because Abraham himself is part of the problem as well as part of the solution. And when I say Abraham, I mean the Jewish people. The problem with the Jews is that, as I once heard Rabbi Lionel Blue say, Jews are just like everybody else, only more so. And the problem that we all have is also a problem that Jews have. So it isn't that Jews are miraculously preserved from human failings and folly, and no wise Jew would claim that either. Paul certainly didn't. So the problem then is, so how can God be faithful to his promises to Abraham? Because surely they've messed up like the rest of us have. And the answer is yes, but from the people of Israel, God has produced the Messiah, who is Jesus, and the Messiah is the faithful Israel in person. And his faithfulness is expressed precisely in his death, which says, yes, that whole thing needed to be put to death, but that was how the world was going to be rescued. So it all comes from Abraham focused on Jesus and to the cross, so that at the heart of the story of the people of God, you get the saving event. If you try to take the saving event, the cross, and put it within a different narrative, it doesn't mean what Paul says it means. That's what's happened in so much Christian theology down the years. So that the heart of my chapter on the people of God, rethought around Jesus and the Spirit, is the story of the cross, and justification which happens as a result of that, and salvation which happens as a result of that. But because it's a dynamic thing, because it's going somewhere, because this is the purpose of God, it isn't simply about, so phew, we get saved so we can go and be with God forever, we are reconciled to God and that's it. Part of the point of this for Paul is when human beings get sorted out, get forgiven, get saved, get healed, get sanctified, get justified, then they get glorified, and glorified is not a coded way of saying going to heaven. It's not an odd way of saying we're going to end up shining like light bulbs, as though that was kind of a good thing to be. Well, we may, who knows, we may not. That's not the point. For Paul, glory is what the Psalm 8 says when it says that humans are crowned with glory and honour and are given dominion over the works of God's hands. God at the beginning made human beings to be his royal priesthood, looking after his world with wise, gentle stewardship and summing up the praises of creation and presenting them before God. That's what the glory of humans is. At the end of Romans 8, that's what it's all about. Humans are restored so that through them the world may be transformed. The extraordinary news, which most Christians have hardly begun to glimpse, is that that already began with the resurrection and the gift of the Spirit. And if that isn't an agenda for the church in tomorrow's world, I don't know what is. So at the heart of the book, yes, the cross, justification, and then long discussion of the law and how that works. These are the central topics of traditional Pauline theology. I have reframed those topics within Paul's revision of all Jewish theology in order to show that this is not a static soteriology, but one which then energizes the mission of the church then and now.